Deep in the backcountry of Hollow County, there are emergency shelters that are maintained for people in trouble. The ranger responsible for them thought they were helping people, but she found something else there. The third shelter on my winter closing circuit was the one that told me something was wrong. And it told me before I even had the door open, because I could smell it from 20 yards up the trail. Cold ash, old and wet, and underneath that, something sort of sweet, like fruit left too long in a bowl. I stood there a second with my hands still on the latch, telling myself it was a dead mouse or mold, before I walked in and looked at what I was afraid I'd find. It was the second week of the winter closing circuit, the stretch of the season where the sun starts setting by 4 in the afternoon, and the high trails hold frost in the shadows even at noon. I'd been on foot since before sunrise to make the 10 miles between the last shelter and this one before the temperature dropped enough to make the switchbacks slick. This particular stop was nothing special on paper. A single-room emergency shelter at just under 7,000 feet, no amenities, no view worth the hike. The kind of place that exists purely so a lost or injured hiker has 4 walls and a wood stove between them and a night that could otherwise kill them. I'd resupplied it myself back in September, same as I do every year, and had no reason on the walk in to expect anything but a routine inventory check and an hour's worth of paperwork before I moved on. The cash was gone. Not raided. Gone. 6 weeks of pre-positioned emergency stores, the woodpile I'd stacked myself in September against the north wall, the sealed bins of dried goods and the propane canisters logged against exactly this kind of eventuality. All of it swept down to bare, packed dirt. The way a floor looks after you've mopped it, not the way a floor looks after something's torn through it. No splintered bins, no claw marks on the doorframe, no scattered husks or gnawed wrappers. The kind of mess even a careful animal leaves behind. And if a hiker had used it the way it's meant to be used, there'd be something left over to show for it. A torn wrapper, a burned candle stub, a few cans still standing because nobody eats through an entire emergency cache in one bad night. There was none of that. Nothing partly used, nothing left over at all. Just clean dirt where 2 cords of split oak and a season's worth of food had been. My first thought, standing there, was the only one that made any sense. Somebody had stolen it. I've run this circuit alone for 6 winters now. 11 backcountry shelters and 2 fire lookouts strung across about 40 miles of high country. All of them due to be sealed up before the first hard snow locks the access roads for good. The job isn't complicated, but it's exact. Each shelter gets inventoried against the log from its last resupply, cross-checked can for can, cord for cord, propane canister for propane canister. You do not want to discover in February that a location you certified full has stood empty since October. Flues get sealed against nesting animals and the drafts that rot a roof out from the inside over a hard winter. Doors and windows get checked for signs of unauthorized overwintering, mostly hunters who think an empty Forest Service shelter is a free cabin, though I've found stranger things than hunters in 9 years of this work. Every stop gets logged and radioed in on a schedule dispatch keeps a hard copy of. Past a certain point on this circuit, there's no cell signal and no other ranger within a day's hike. Dispatch expects a check-in at least every 2 days, whenever I hit a rise with enough signal to reach them. Miss 2 in a row, and that's when someone starts the process of coming to find me, which, from the far end of this circuit, can take the better part of a week to actually arrive. I've pulled people out of trouble on this circuit before, and none of it looked like what I was standing in front of now. A hunter with a broken tibia I splinted and half-carried 2 miles to a spot the helicopter could reach. A father and son who'd wandered off a marked trail in September fog and spent a night in one of these exact shelters eating out of the cache I was now standing in front of. Empty. I don't spook at an empty pantry. I have a whole professional vocabulary for describing real trouble calmly on a radio to a dispatcher 40 miles away, and none of it had a category for what I was looking at. That cache wasn't accessible by vehicle. It wasn't a spot bears den near, not at that elevation, not that late in the season, and I'd have found sign of a den if it were. A person could theoretically hike in and strip it, but a person doing that leaves boot prints, leaves drag marks where they hauled 2 cords of wood and 40 pounds of canned goods back out, leaves something. There was nothing. Just the smell, the dirt, and the specific, deliberate cleanliness of a room that had been eaten, rather than robbed. I logged it as bear activity, unconfirmed, cache compromised, recommend inspection, and kept moving. Because that's the job. You don't turn back off a 10-day circuit for one bad shelter. You note it, you keep closing, and you flag it for spring. The next shelter on the route was 6 miles further in, a squat little A-frame I'd restocked myself, personally, 8 days earlier. I remembered doing it. I remembered the specific ache in my shoulders from carrying the last of the propane up that final quarter mile of switchbacks. Remembered shutting the door behind me and thinking, there, that one's done for the year. It was the same. Worse, in a way, because 8 days is not enough time for anything natural to account for what I found. A cache stripped down to swept dirt, no scent of animal, no drag marks, no sign that anything had come or gone the way things that eat actually come and go. There was one print, though, half-formed in a soft patch just inside the threshold, and it didn't belong to anything I could name. Too broad for a boot, too narrow for a bear. A set of toe marks that didn't line up with any animal I'd ever tracked, and didn't sit right on a human foot either, like whatever made it was still deciding on the shape. I photographed it, told myself it was a smear where 2 different tracks had overlapped, and made myself stop looking before I talked myself into something I couldn't put on a radio. Whatever had been in that cabin had gotten in, taken everything down to the last can, and left without another trace of how. I stood in that doorway longer than I should have, doing math I didn't like the answer to. 8 days, 6 miles between the 2 sites, over terrain that takes me the better part of a day to cross on a good trail. No vehicle access to either. No way a person, or a bear, or anything I had a name for, covered that ground that fast, carrying that weight, and left behind exactly one print that belonged to neither. It wasn't only the food either, though the food was the part I could quantify. The first aid kit was gone from its wall mount. So was the hand axe that's supposed to hang by the stove. The box of strike-anywhere matches I'd restocked myself was missing too. None of it useful as calories, all of it gone with the same swept, deliberate thoroughness as the food. An animal doesn't want your matches. An animal doesn't know what an axe is for. Whatever had gone through that cabin had taken the entire idea of the place. Everything that made it a shelter and not just 4 walls, down to nothing. I radioed it in that night from the little rise where I could just catch enough signal to reach dispatch, and dispatch did what dispatch does with a report like that. Took it seriously enough to log it, not seriously enough to pull me off the circuit. A bear that hasn't denned yet, mobile, opportunistic, hitting caches ahead of a hard winter, happens some years, especially late ones, and my supervisor floated exactly that on the radio, not unkindly, just practically. Or squatters, working the circuit ahead of me, stripping shelters before I got there to seal them. That happens too, usually hunters who've decided an empty cabin is a resource rather than government property. Both explanations were plausible, both had precedent. Neither one required anything I hadn't already dealt with in 6 seasons of this work. The relief was real, not performed for anyone. I had 6 more shelters and a fire lookout to close before the weather turned. No reasonable way to abort a resupply circuit that deep in the backcountry, short of a genuine emergency, and a perfectly good, perfectly boring explanation, sitting right there waiting to be used. I used it. Bear moving ahead of me, getting greedy before its own denning. Or a squatter working fast and sloppy clean because he doesn't want to get caught with government stores in his pack. Either way, something I had procedures for. Something that didn't require me to stand in an empty cabin doing math about 8 days and 6 miles and no tracks. So I kept moving. 2 more shelters over the next 2 days, both intact, both exactly as I'd left them at last resupply. Each one that came back clean felt like a small vindication. Ordinary, I told myself. Still ordinary. I fell back into the rhythm of the job. Boots, inventory sheets, the particular satisfaction of a flue sealed clean against the first snow. For 2 days, I mostly forgot to be afraid. You can forget almost anything if the work in front of you is demanding enough to fill the space fear was using. The first real cold front of the season came through on the second of those 2 days, dropping a dusting of snow above 8,000 feet and putting an edge on the wind that hadn't been there the week before. There's something about the actual physical business of winter arriving. Frozen bootlaces, a wood stove that needs coaxing, the particular ache of cold hands doing fine work with an inventory pencil. It leaves less room for anything else. I remember standing on the porch of the fifth shelter that second evening, watching my breath fog in the last of the light, thinking, almost fondly, that this was just the job. Ordinary hardship. The kind I signed up for. It was on the trail to the sixth shelter that I found the first sign of an actual person, and for a while, it felt like a relief. A lean-to of cut branches and a stretched tarp, tucked back off the trail where you wouldn't see it unless you were looking for it. A fire ring, cold, but used more than once. A row of cans, empty, rinsed, set upright in a neat little line like someone was proud of not littering. Boot prints all around it, ordinary boot prints, human-shaped and human-sized, the kind of tracks I've spent a career reading. I stood there, almost smiling, because a person is a problem with a name and a procedure. Unauthorized overwintering. I had a form for that. I found him an hour later, at the edge of a clearing above the lean-to, close enough that I understood he'd probably watched me coming for a while before I ever saw him. Older than I expected, maybe 60, dressed in 3 decades of donated hunting gear, beard gone the color of dirty snow. He didn't run and didn't reach for anything, just stood with his hands loose at his sides the way you're taught to stand when you don't want to look like a threat. I identified myself, told him camping without a permit this deep in the closing season was a problem I could work with him on if he came in peaceful, and asked him straight out if he'd been into any of the emergency caches. He laughed at that, not unkindly, more like I'd asked something a little sad. Said he'd never touch a cache. Said the word never twice, like it mattered to him that I believed that one specific thing, even if I believed nothing else he was about to say. Then he went quiet, and told me the woods keep their own accounts, and that every door I shut on a shelter I'd left full was a promise I was making to something that collects on promises, and I'd do well to leave a little out before I sealed a place up, rather than take every last thing and call it secure. I asked him what he meant by it. He looked at me a long moment and said I'd know it when I saw it, and that when I did, I shouldn't run the way a person runs. I logged him as a transient, noted his location for the file, and told him I'd be back through with someone from the district office before the passes closed, that he needed a plan that didn't involve wintering out here alone. He said he had a plan. He didn't say what it was. I left him there because I had 6 more shelters and a lookout tower left on my circuit, and no grounds to compel a grown man off public land on the spot, and because, I'll admit it, some part of me had already decided he was my answer. A hungry, half-feral old man stripping caches he swore up and down he'd never touched, spinning a story about the woods and their accounts to cover for it. It fit well enough that I let myself feel something close to safe again for the first time in 4 days. The last 3 miles to that shelter were the longest 3 miles I've walked on this circuit in 6 years. Even though the trail itself is easy, a gentle grade through open timber I could ordinarily cover without thinking about my feet at all. I thought about every step of it that afternoon. The wind had picked up with the cold front, enough to keep the trees moving in a way that made every shift of light look, for a fraction of a second, like something crouched and then wasn't. By the time the shelter's roofline came into view through the trees, the light had gone that particular flat gray it goes right before full dark, the kind of light that makes it hard to trust your own eyes about anything more than 50 feet away, and I remember consciously deciding not to hurry, because hurrying felt like exactly the wrong thing to do. Part of me was almost hoping I'd cross the old man's path again before I got there. A familiar kind of trouble felt better than the alternative I hadn't let myself name yet. I reached that shelter at dusk, later than I'd planned. The door was standing open. Not broken, not forced, just open. The way you'd leave it if you'd walked in and hadn't bothered to close it behind you. Someone was standing just inside it, in the deepening dark of the doorway, with their back to the trail, And for one clean, relieved second, I thought, there he is, caught in the act, exactly the way I'd half hoped I would be. Told him to turn around, slow, hands where I could see them, the same flat voice I use on anyone I catch somewhere they shouldn't be. I even took a step toward the doorway, already composing the radio call that would close this whole thing out clean. Transient apprehended, caches accounted for, situation resolved. It turned at the sound of my voice, slow and even, like something on a track. Nobody startled by a ranger's voice turns like that. It was thin. Not thin the way a starved old man living rough is thin, but thin the way a thing looks when it was built for a different set of proportions and had to make do with these. Too tall for the door frame, shoulders narrow in a way that made the rest of it look stretched rather than starved. This was not the man from the clearing. This had never been the man from the clearing. It came off that threshold fast, faster than anything that shape should have been able to move. And every bit of training I have says you do not run from something that outweighs you and knows the ground better than you do. And every bit of training I have was wrong for those next 20 seconds, because I ran anyway. I went backward off the porch, and then I was just running, downhill, off the trail, branches taking skin off my forearms, and I could hear it behind me, close. A heavy, uneven crash through brush that shouldn't have been able to keep pace with anything on two legs. Then, between one stride and the next, it wasn't behind me anymore. No slowing crash, no retreat I could hear, just an absence where a presence had been a half second before. I kept running anyway, another quarter mile at least, until my legs made the decision for me, and I went down hard in a stand of laurel, and lay there, listening to nothing but my own heart, for longer than I want to admit. I didn't understand, lying there, why it had let me get that far. I understood it even less by the time I'd stopped shaking enough to stand. It isn't until later that I found a shape for it. In the moment, there was only the fact of being alive, and the fact of not being followed, and no way yet to explain either one. I didn't go back for my pack, dropped somewhere in the first 30 yards of running, until daylight. I radioed my position from a clearing I didn't fully trust either, logged the sighting in language careful enough that dispatch wouldn't pull me off the circuit for it, and honest enough that I could live with having written it, though I left the running out of the official version. I made camp on bare rock a half-mile off, somewhere with sight lines in every direction and nothing at my back. I did not sleep. It was somewhere in those sleepless hours, going back over the whole circuit in my head, the order of the shelters, the dates I'd resupplied each one, the dates I'd be sealing each one for the winter, that the shape of what was actually happening finally organized itself into something I could understand. The chase was the piece that allowed it all to click, once I let myself sit still with it. I've been charged by a black bear exactly once in 9 years, a sow with cubs who came at me hard for maybe 30 feet before peeling off the second I'd put real distance between us and her den, because the whole point was never to catch me, only to make sure I left. What had come off that threshold moved the same way, fast, loud, close enough to taste, and then simply finished the moment I was far enough from whatever it considered its own ground. It hadn't been hunting me. It had been running me off a kill site, the way anything territorial runs off anything that gets too close to a fresh one. And the fact that it had that kind of restraint, sitting right alongside that kind of speed, scared me in a way the running itself hadn't. That was when the old man's rambling stopped sounding like rambling. Leave a little out for it before you seal a place up. Don't run the way you run from a person. He hadn't been confessing to anything when he swore he'd never touched a cache. He'd been telling me, as plainly as a person can tell a stranger something like that and still expect to be believed. I thought about hiking back to find him and ask him the rest of it properly, and then I thought about the fact that I hadn't seen his lean-to again on my way past it that evening. Not the fire ring, not the neat row of rinsed cans, like the whole camp had been packed up or swept away in the few hours between when I'd left him and when I'd come back through. I never did find him again. I don't know if that means anything. I've decided I'd rather not know which answer I'm hoping for. Closing a shelter isn't just shutting a door. It's a specific, documented act. Inventory confirmed, flue sealed, structure certified vacant and secure for the season, checked off a list that goes back to dispatch and, eventually, into a file that says this place will not be watched again until spring. I had been doing that, methodically, shelter by shelter, for the better part of 2 weeks, working my way along a fixed route in a fixed order that had been set months ago and that I had never once deviated from in 6 seasons. Because there was never a reason to. I went through it by date, out loud, in a whisper, the way you talk yourself through a checklist when there's no one else to check it against. Shelter 1. Resupplied in September. Cache found stripped on the day I arrived to close it. Shelter 2. Resupplied 8 days prior, stripped the same afternoon I got there. Nothing had ever been hit early. Nothing had ever been hit while I still had a resupply logged as current and a closing still pending. Every single strike had landed in the window that opened the moment I certified a location done and moved my attention to the next one on the list. Never before, never during, always exactly after. Every cache I'd found stripped had been a shelter I'd already closed, or was about to close, on this exact trip. Every fresh sighting had come after I'd sealed the previous location and moved on. I wasn't finding a predator working ahead of my circuit at random. I was watching something track my own closing schedule in real time, moving into each location precisely as I certified it unwatched, staying just far enough ahead that the pattern read as coincidence until you laid all the dates out end to end, the way I finally forced myself to that night. My checklist, the exact document that was supposed to mean a place was safely secured against the winter, was functionally a countdown. Each shelter I closed was one more door I'd personally certified nobody would be checking on again until spring. And there was one shelter left on my route, the last stop before the trailhead, the one nearest where my truck was parked and waiting. I looked at the map a long time that night, tracing the 6 seasons of habit that had put me on this exact route in this exact order, and understood that whatever was doing this hadn't needed to hunt me across open country at all. It had just needed to read the same schedule I'd been handing dispatch every season, and let me walk myself, one certified empty shelter at a time, toward the last one on the list. I got to that last shelter, the fire lookout tower at the trailhead end of the circuit, the one stop on the whole route with a name I actually use instead of a number, because every ranger before me has called it the same thing for 40 years, a full day ahead of where the pattern said I should arrive. I don't fully know why I moved the schedule up. Some instinct that said, closing early, out of order, breaking my own routine for the first time in 6 seasons, was the only card I had left to play. It was already there. The tower sits above the tree line. The last 100 feet of the approach is nothing but switchback stairs bolted to the outside of the structure. No cover, no way up or down except straight through whatever's waiting at the top. I climbed those stairs with the wind coming up cold and steady off the ridge. No sound anywhere except my own boots on the metal, and my own breath, going ragged well before the exertion should have accounted for it. Framed clean in the tower's open doorway, not hidden at the edge of anything this time. Not one blink ahead of a beam of light the way I half expected. Just standing, fully visible, in the low gray of a sky about to lose its last light. Skin stretched too tight over a frame built too tall for any doorway on this circuit. The joints of it wrong in a way I still can't diagram, even having stood there and looked directly at it. Its mouth was moving. Not speaking, not yet. Working, the way you work a muscle that's never done a particular motion before, and is teaching itself the shape of it in real time. What it was shaping, slow and wet and almost there, was the first syllable of my own name. I have called in 100 routine closeouts in 6 years on this circuit. I did not call this one in as routine, and I didn't wait to see whether it finished the word. I broke the one rule I've never broken before. Every shelter gets inventoried and sealed shut before I move on, no matter what I find inside. I backed away from that tower without doing any of it. Didn't inventory, didn't seal the flue, didn't confirm the structure secure. Left the door standing open behind me, instead of doing the single thing every season of training has drilled into me as non-negotiable before winter cuts a place off from any help until spring. I'd always understood that rule as being about what a sealed shelter keeps out. Nothing denning down somewhere it shouldn't. Nothing getting into supplies meant for whoever needs them in March. I understand it differently now. Sealing a place shut also decides that nothing gets back out of it either. Not until spring. And this time, I couldn't make myself be the one who decided that. I radioed dispatch the closeout on that last shelter the same flat procedural way I've radioed every closeout before it. Structure inspected, certified vacant, secure for the season. It was the version of the truth I trusted myself to say out loud without my voice doing something I'd have to explain afterward. It isn't true. I know it isn't true. Somewhere under an unsealed flue and a door I left standing open on purpose, in a fire tower 40 miles from the nearest plowed road, is something that spent 2 weeks learning to read my own paperwork well enough to walk it, patiently, all the way to my name. I don't know yet whether leaving that door open bought it a way out before the passes closed, or just bought it a way to keep feeding through everything the winter still has left to give it. I won't know until the roads open again in spring, and I check that shelter first, before any of the others, the way I have never once needed to before.